My name is Michael Andrews. I have 69 years old, and I'm from Salt Lake City, Utah. For over 30 years, I was a devout Mormon, a faithful husband, and a devoted servant of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I believed my life was an example of faith, obedience, and love for God. But today, with a heavy heart and a trembling voice, I must share something that has been stuck inside me for too long. My wife went through something no human being should ever face, and within the church itself, the place where we sought solace. For years, we tried to believe that silence was God's will, that pain had a purpose. But I understood too late that silence protects those who do evil and destroys those who suffer. Today, I speak out because I can no longer carry the weight of what I saw and experienced. Comment your city and country, so I know where my story is going. Leave your like if you believe that faith needs to walk hand in hand with truth, and subscribe to hear real stories. When I married Elizabeth, we were the picture of what everyone called a perfect Mormon family. Young, full of faith, with the same purpose, to serve God wholeheartedly. We met at a church activity when we were still young, and from the first day, I knew she was different. She had a sparkle in her eyes that reflected purity and spiritual strength. She was the kind of woman who believed that every small gesture could please the Lord. The more we obey, the closer we will be to God, she said, and I believed her wholeheartedly. In the early years of our marriage, we lived almost like missionaries in our own home. We woke early to pray, studied the scriptures together, and fasted in search of personal revelation. The walls of our home were covered with pictures of verses and photos of holy temples. Every meal was preceded by prayer. Every decision was discussed in light of the Lord's will. There was no doubt, only faith. Elizabeth was admired by everyone in the community. The Relief Society sisters saw her as an example of kindness and dedication. She was the first to arrive at meetings and the last to leave, helping to clean the hall, arrange chairs, and comfort those in need. I, however, aspired to a future of service and leadership. The bishops praised our discipline and called us a chosen family. These words filled us with pride, as if we were direct instruments of God. On Sundays, I wore my best suit, she her modest, elegant dress. We walked to church together, hand in hand, feeling we were part of something sacred. I saw her eyes light up when the hymns began. Elizabeth sang with emotion, as if each note were a prayer. When the choir fell silent, the silence was filled with a peace that seemed to touch heaven. We believed that living this way, without question, without wavering, was the true path to salvation. However, today I realized there was an innocence within us, a faith that didn't know how to distinguish obedience from submission. We were never taught to ask, only to accept. And at that time, this seemed like a virtue to us. The Lord speaks through his prophets, they said. And we, blinded by devotion, repeated, Amen. The routine was demanding but sacred. Elizabeth lovingly prepared primary lessons, and I spent my nights reviewing talks for priesthood meetings. The temple was the center of our lives, not just a physical place, but an extension of our home. Everything we did was meant to be worthy. Every choice, every word, every thought was measured with the weight of eternity. I remember Sunday mornings, the smell of fresh bread coming out of the oven, the sound of neighborhood children running through the streets before church. Elizabeth would comb her hair in front of the mirror and smiling say, Today is the day to serve. That smile was the image of our faith, simple, sincere, and absolute. But like all unquestioned faith, ours too began to become a gilded prison. There was something in our dedication that bordered on fanaticism, but we didn't realize it. The fear of displeasing God made us say yes to everything, to responsibilities, to demands, to long hours of service. We never said no, not when our bodies begged for rest, nor when our hearts begged for a break. Our leaders reinforced the idea that sacrifice was the greatest proof of divine love. God rewards those who persevere, they repeated. And we persevered, even when fatigue turned to pain. Elizabeth's eyes began to lose their sparkle, but she hid it behind a smile. I'm just tired, she said. And I, blinded by the ideal of perfection, believed it. There was something almost poetic about the way she lived her faith. She cared for the sick, visited the poor, and made meals for families in need. Everyone admired her. Some said she looked like an angel. I was proud, thinking we had found the perfect balance between earthly and heavenly love. But what I didn't realize was that, little by little, what we called service was draining the life out of her. Deep down, I believe that we will be blessed the more we serve, that every sacrifice brings us closer to the promised eternity. The Lord sees everything, I told her, and will reward every tear. But now I know there are tears God never asked for. Our home, seen from the outside, was an example of purity and harmony. But inside, the weight of pressure, of expectations, of the need to be perfect, all the time was beginning to build. Elizabeth rarely complained. When something bothered her, she simply shut up and knelt. Prayer heals everything, she said. I believed it. So did she. The years passed, and our devotion only grew along with our weariness. Elizabeth became a woman who was strong on the outside, yet quietly fragile on the inside. Yet, she never stopped serving. I saw her body tired, but her spirit insisted. Sometimes I saw her looking out the window, as if silently conversing with God. When I asked her what she was thinking, she simply replied, "I'm asking for strength." Looking back now, I realized that the perfection we sought was a trap. The faith that guided us also blinded us. We believed that the more we obeyed, the closer we would be to God, and in the end, we only grew further from ourselves. That unbreakable faith, which seemed to protect us, began to transform into a wall, and without realizing it, we were trapped inside it, smiling on the outside, suffering on the inside. It was in this setting of devotion and apparent holiness that pain began to creep in slowly, without warning, like a shadow creeping through the house while everyone else sleeps. And so began the story that would change everything, a story of faith, of love, of silence, and of awakening. Our life's routine revolved around the church. Each week was carefully organized according to the calendar of activities and meetings. Monday was dedicated to family home evening, where we read the scriptures and taught principles of faith to our children. Wednesday was the day for priesthood meetings, and on Sundays, we were always ready well ahead of schedule, because arriving early at the temple was a sign of reverence. No holiday, illness, or fatigue kept us from our obligations. Our entire life seemed like a long list of sacred commitments, and to each one we gave our all. We were taught that happiness came from serving, even when our bodies and souls were crying out for rest. Elizabeth believed this more than anyone. She woke before dawn, prepared the fasting, food, spent hours cooking for fundraisers, and still found the strength to visit the sick and care for the primary children. At night, she read the scriptures with me and smiled, even when exhausted. "The Lord blesses those who give themselves without complaining," she would say. And I, proud, saw in her an example of living faith. People in the community admired her. "Sister Elizabeth is a virtuous woman," the leaders said. She received praise for her dedication, her calmness, and her willingness to help. She was the kind of person who never said no, even when she could barely stand. Her body was already showing signs of fatigue, but no one noticed, or perhaps no one wanted to notice. The image of perfection needed to be maintained. Within the church, everything was a reason for service. A new calling? We accepted. A missionary event? We were there. A problem in the ward? We rushed to solve it. Faith became a marathon, and the goal was the approval of the leaders. "The harder we work, the more the Lord will reward us," they said, and we believed blindly. The temple was the center of our spiritual life. Each visit was a ceremony of obedience. I remember the profound silence, the white robes, the soft hymns echoing off the walls. Inside, I felt I was touching the sacred, and at the same time, something inside me began to wonder if that peace was real or just a reflection of our discipline. Elizabeth, however, never doubted. "This is the house of the Lord," she would whisper. I saw tears streaming down her face, and I thought they were tears of joy. Today I understand that, often, they were tears of exhaustion. Leaders began calling on us more frequently. They asked for help preparing meetings, organizing events, visiting families, raising funds, caring for struggling members. It all seemed noble, but each new task took more time, more energy, more life. The weeks became an endless cycle of obligations. I saw my wife slowly crumbling, but the message of faith wouldn't let us stop. Once, she fainted during a prolonged fast. When I told the bishop, he simply said, "Sometimes the body is weak, brother, but the spirit is strong." Elizabeth heard this and smiled. "It's true," she replied, even though she was pale. I wanted to scream, to tell her she needed rest, but the words died before they could come out. It was as if asking for help was a sign of spiritual weakness. Sundays, once filled with joy, became days of tension. Everything had to be impeccable: their clothes, their behavior, their words. Any slip-up could be interpreted as a lack of dignity. Elizabeth felt the weight of this perfection. She spent hours preparing the children, reviewing their speeches, correcting every detail. I could see the weariness in her eyes, but she insisted, "We are serving the Lord. He will give us strength." Months turned into years. What began as enthusiasm became routine, and routine became sacrifice. I sensed something was wrong, but I didn't know how to stop. The gears of faith don't allow for pauses. The church needed us, and we needed to believe it made sense. There was an invisible fear of disappointing God, of losing our temple recommend, of being seen as lukewarm in our faith. This fear was the fuel that kept everyone moving. It was during this period that Elizabeth began to get sick. Nothing serious at first, just constant fatigue, back pain, a heavy look in her eyes. "It's my body asking for a break," I would say. "The Lord understands," but she would reply, "I can't stop now. There are so many people in need." And she continued, even though she was exhausted. The bishop and the leaders continued to praise her. "Your wife is an example to all the sisters," they told me. I smiled, but inside I felt a growing anguish. What they called an example, I saw as suffering disguised as virtue. But who would dare question it? Within the church, obedience was synonymous with faith, and Elizabeth was the most obedient of all. One night, during a charity event, I noticed her trembling as she served dinner to the missionaries. I tried to convince her to rest, but she insisted on staying until the end. When we returned home, she collapsed in my arms. She cried softly, without saying a word. It was the first time I realized something inside her was breaking. In the following days, exhaustion turned to silence. The woman who had once sung hymns now sat by the window, staring into space. I tried to talk, but she would only say, "I need to be at peace with God." I didn't understand that this was a cry for help. Looking back today, I realized that our total dedication wasn't just faith. It was fear of disappointment, fear of failure, fear of being judged for not giving enough. The church taught us to serve to the limit, but never taught us to take care of ourselves. And it was at this limit, between love for God and self-denial, that faith began to become a burden. The woman everyone called a saint was slowly fading before my eyes, and I, with all my devotion, couldn't save her, because I believed that sacrifice was synonymous with salvation. It was the beginning of the end of our innocence. The moment I realized that faith, when overtaxed, stops healing and starts hurting. As the months passed, the dedication that once filled Elizabeth with joy began to become a burden. Within the church, the environment became increasingly rigorous. Every step, every word, and even every thought seemed to have to follow an invisible pattern. "The wife of a man of faith must be an example to all," the leaders said. And that meant always smiling, always willing, always silent, even when her heart screamed. The leaders began to observe her differently. When she missed a meeting because she was tired, comments soon arrived. "Sister Elizabeth is weak in faith." If she showed sadness, they said she lacked gratitude. And if by chance she questioned something, she was warned with cold gentleness, "Be careful, sister. The enemy begins with doubt." Gradually, her faith ceased to be a shelter and became a prison where obedience was the only way to survive. They said the wife of a man of faith should endure everything in silence. That true love for God was measured by the ability to remain steadfast, even under pain and injustice. And she believed it. When I tried to talk to her, she would say, "It's just a test. The Lord is molding us." I wanted to believe her, but I could see something inside her being lost. Every day, the lively, joyful, radiant woman began to disappear, replaced by someone who simply obeyed. Control within the church was subtle but constant. Women were taught to trust the priesthood, and that meant trusting men, even when those men made them suffer. Elizabeth heard advice that sounded pious but hid a cruel weight. A virtuous wife keeps silent and prays for her husband. Suffering is the price of salvation. The Lord gives the hardest battles to his best soldiers. Beautiful phrases that, said over and over, became walls around her mind. The pressure came not only from the leaders, but from the community itself. If she looked sad, someone would quickly say, "You need to smile more. Faith is joy." If she cried, she was seen as ungrateful. If she vented, someone would remind her not to speak ill of the Lord's servants. Every human emotion was treated as a spiritual weakness. And so, my wife began to fall ill not just in body, but in soul. The symptoms were silent at first. She would lose sleep and cry at night for no apparent reason. She said she felt a weight on her chest, as if something were suffocating her. I would find her kneeling in the living room, praying for hours. "I'm asking the Lord to make me stronger," she would say. But I knew what she was really asking for was permission to breathe. She began to isolate herself. She avoided social gatherings, spoke less in meetings, and when asked if she was okay, she would respond with a forced smile. God is good. No one realized how much of a shield that phrase was. The women in the ward praised her admirable patience, unaware that it was destroying her mental health. One afternoon, I saw her writing a letter. When I asked what it was, she simply replied, "It's for myself, to remember who I was before all this." Those words stuck with me. Before all this. As if the church, which should have strengthened her, had erased her identity. In public, she remained perfect, the faithful wife of the priesthood man. People greeted her reverently, and she responded politely, even when she could barely hold their gaze. I could sense the exhaustion hidden behind the kindness. Sometimes, during services, I would see her expression lost in the hymns. Her body was there, but her mind wandered to some distant place, where perhaps it could be free. The pressure mounted. The leaders demanded more. "Your wife's example inspires the entire congregation," they would say to me. And I, without realizing it, repeated the same words to her. "They're right, love. You're an inspiration." Only later did I understand that. With that phrase, I was helping to push her even deeper into the abyss of blind obedience. One night, I found her crying in the bathroom. She looked at herself in the mirror and whispered, "I don't want to disappoint the church. I don't want to disappoint God." I tried to hug her, but she pulled away. "You don't understand," she said. "If I fail, you fail. And if we fail, we shame the priesthood." Those words cut me to the core. The woman I loved was disappearing before my eyes, crushed by a system that confused faith with submission. Gradually, the nights grew longer. I heard her murmuring prayers in the dark, asking forgiveness for things that were never sins, for feeling sad, for feeling tired, for longing for some rest. The guilt was so deep that she began to believe suffering was her only way to prove her fidelity. Her body began to react. She became ill in a way that doctors called emotional. She lost weight, lost the glow of her skin, and sometimes spent the day silently, sitting in the same place. When I asked the bishop if we should take some time off from our activities to care for her, he replied, "Sometimes the enemy uses physical weakness to mislead the strong. Keep serving, brother. The Lord will sustain your wife." And we continued. We continued because fear was greater than reason, because obedience was the only path we were taught. God's love, which once offered comfort, became a burden. Faith, which once brought peace, became a burden. Today, I understand that obedience without discernment is a form of blindness. My wife believed she was pleasing God, but what she was doing was slowly destroying herself in the name of a perfection no one attains. The woman who once smiled with hope now struggled just to survive spiritually. As she lost strength, they found excuses. There was always a verse, a doctrine, a heavenly reason to justify her pain, and it was in this environment of distorted faith and sacred silence that I began to realize what I had never considered. That something within the church, something in the shadows of all that obedience, was wrong, very wrong. The turning point came quietly, like all devastating things. Elizabeth still believed that leaders were chosen by God, and that every word they spoke was sacred. I believed it too. For years, we had been taught to blindly trust the priesthood. If the bishop spoke, it was God speaking. If the stake president decided something, it was heaven's will. And it was precisely this trust, pure, naive, and blind, that opened the door to the spiritual abuse that would destroy my wife's faith. It all began with a visit from the stake president. He came to the house under the pretense of offering spiritual guidance. Elizabeth, always respectful, welcomed him with an open heart. He praised her for her dedication, her obedience, and for being an exemplary woman among the Hmong sisters in the ward. At first, the words sounded like comfort, but soon the veiled demands began. Sister Elizabeth, you need to be stronger. A priesthood wife must inspire, even when she suffers. Your faith is being tested. These words hurt her more than he could have imagined. She was already fragile, trying to keep up appearances, and hearing that her pain was a sign of spiritual weakness made her shut down completely. That night, she said to me, if even the leaders think I'm failing, maybe I really am disappointing the Lord. It was the first time I heard her voice break. And from then on, it began to fade a little more each day. The visits continued. The leader appeared frequently, always with the same paternalistic and authoritarian tone. He said that true faith demands sacrifice, that devout women must bear their burdens in silence, that suffering was a blessing in disguise. Elizabeth listened with her head bowed, believing every word. When I tried to intervene, he cut me off. Brother, the priesthood is older than marriage. Let the Lord work through your wife. And so, the space between us widened, filled by the voices of men who claimed to represent God. One day, she returned from an interview with the bishop with swollen eyes. I asked what had happened, but she simply replied, he said my suffering reflects my lack of faith. I remained silent, unsure of what to say. Anger burned inside me, but the fear of questioning was even greater. In the church, too, question a leader was to question God himself. Over the next few weeks, her behavior changed. She no longer wanted to sing in church services or participate in meetings. When someone asked why she was so quiet, she would smile and say, I'm learning humility. What no one knew was that behind that smile lay humiliation. During a women's council, one of the leaders publicly told her, Sister Elizabeth needs to pray more and complain less. The Lord demands joy even in suffering. Everyone laughed condescendingly, and she, embarrassed, lowered her head. I watched from afar, my stomach churning. Then I realized something terrible was happening. After that meeting, she went days without eating properly. She said she needed to purify herself. She prayed for hours, asking forgiveness for sins she never committed. I watched her torture herself with guilt, and I felt like the church was sucking her soul dry, drop by drop. Once, I heard her whisper to herself, I wish I could feel God... All I feel is fear. The situation worsened when one of the leaders, under the pretense of spiritual guidance, began invading her privacy. He asked for intimate details about her marital life, justifying it as necessary to maintain the purity of the home. Elizabeth, embarrassed, obeyed, believing she was fulfilling a commandment. When she told me this, I was paralyzed. The shock was so great that I couldn't react. It was as if the entire system that sustained our faith had turned against us. She tried to report her discomfort to another member of the church, but was silenced. Be careful what you say. We don't want to cause strife among the Lord's servants. That warning was the final straw. From then on, Elizabeth never spoke of what happened again. She bottled it all up, transforming fear into silence and silence into illness. The glow of faith that had once sustained her began to fade. She no longer prayed aloud. When we opened the Book of Mormon together, her eyes wandered the pages without reading. Sometimes during worship, I saw tears streaming quietly down her face as everyone sang. No hymn could touch the emptiness the church had left within her. My wife believed God spoke through them, until one of them destroyed her faith. That sentence still echoes in my mind. What she experienced wasn't just disappointment, it was a spiritual violation. A kind of abuse that leaves no scars on the body but wounds the soul irreversibly. One night, I found her sitting on the kitchen floor, holding the pendant she always wore, a small silver ring with the temple symbol. She stared at it and whispered, "I gave everything to God, and they took it all away." I knelt beside her, trying to comfort her, but she was distant, as if part of her mind was no longer there. From that moment on, the faith that once united us began to tear us apart. I wanted to protect her, but I was also afraid. Afraid of confronting the system, afraid of being punished, afraid of losing the community that had been our entire lives. And this fear, fueled by years of doctrine and obedience, made me complicit in the silence. Elizabeth was becoming a shadow of her former self. She spoke little, slept poorly, and cried in secret. Sometimes she apologized to me for shaming the priesthood. I told her she didn't owe anyone an apology, but it was useless. Shame had already taken hold within her. There I realized that her faith had become wounded, that the God of love had been replaced by a God of fear, shaped by the voices of men who claimed to represent him. And when I realized this, I understood that the real sin wasn't in her. It was in all who used God's name to control, hurt, and silence. It was there, faced with the silent pain of the woman I loved most, that my own faith began to crumble. And for the first time, I began to wonder if the God I sought still lived in that temple, or if he had fled along with my wife's soul. The following months were like crossing a desert, in silence. Elizabeth barely spoke anymore, and when she did, it was only the bare essentials. The sweet voice that used to fill the house with hymns had disappeared. What remained was a weary murmur, as if each word cost a piece of her soul. I tried to talk, but she only smiled, an empty, polite smile that seemed more like a plea for me not to insist. The house, once filled with prayers and laughter, had become a temple of fear, where silence was the only way to survive. Her emotional trauma seeped into everything. In the mornings, I would find her standing in front of the mirror, staring blankly at her reflection. Sometimes she would touch her face as if she no longer recognized it. "I'm not who I used to be," she whispered once. That phrase haunted me for weeks. I wanted to hug her, tell her none of this was her fault, but the weight of shame hung between us, invisible and suffocating. The faith that once united our home now separated it, a wall built of fear, guilt, and silence. I felt torn. Part of me wanted to confront the leaders, shout out what they had done. Another part feared the consequences. "You shall not raise a hand against the Lord's anointed," the doctrine said. This phrase bound me inside. I had been trained to obey, and now that obedience made me a coward. I spent nights praying, asking forgiveness for something I hadn't even done. I asked forgiveness for doubting, for hating, for not having the strength to defend her. There was something cruel about watching the woman I loved slowly fade away, while everyone around us pretended nothing was wrong. At church, people kept smiling at us. "What a blessed couple," they'd say. And we'd smile back, feigning a happiness that no longer existed. After services, we'd walk home in silence, unable to look at each other. The love was still there, but covered in wounds that institutional faith didn't heal, it only deepened. Guilt was my constant companion. I asked myself daily, why didn't I do anything? Why? Did I stay silent when she was humiliated? Why did I trust the authority of men more than my wife's pain? I was a man of the priesthood, but I felt smaller than ever. The religion that promised liberation had turned me into a prisoner of fear. Elizabeth, for her part, began to withdraw from everything. She stopped attending meetings, then stopped opening her scriptures. One day, I found her hymn book torn and thrown in a drawer. She looked at me and said, "You sing, I can't anymore." There was no anger in her voice, only an old sadness, a wound that no longer hurt, but consumed. At night I heard her crying. Sometimes she murmured prayers asking God to take her quickly, so the pain would end. Other times she asked for forgiveness for having believed so much. I stood outside the room, not daring to enter. I listened to her words and felt like a traitor, not only as a husband, but as a man of faith. I, who had so often preached about the power of obedience, now saw clearly how destructive it can be when blinded. The isolation intensified. Our old friends from church began to drift away. No one called, no one asked how we were. The community's silence was a sentence. Talking about what had happened was unthinkable. Reporting meant being expelled, losing everything, friends, respect, our very identity within the faith. And so we chose silence, not out of cowardice, but for survival. But silence comes at a price. Little by little, the marriage began to unravel in gestures. We no longer touched each other with the same tenderness. There was a chasm between us, full of unspoken words. Sometimes she would look at me as if she wanted to say something, but decided against it. Other times, I would open my mouth to speak, but fear silenced me. It was like living next to a ghost, someone present in body, but absent in soul. I could see the guilt eating away at Elizabeth from the inside out. She believed she had offended God, that suffering was her punishment. No argument I could convince her otherwise. When I said the leaders were wrong, she would gently rebuke me. They are the Lord's servants. If they erred, it's because God wanted it that way. This kind of submission tore me apart. It was like watching a prisoner defending the jailer. One afternoon, she handed me a folded letter. It simply said, "If I am ever no longer here, tell the women who serve that God does not want their silence." I wept reading those words. It was a suppressed cry, the voice of someone who could no longer bear her own pain. I have kept that letter to this day. It is the most painful and truest memento of the woman she was. Time left its mark on both of us. Faith became a shadow, hope, a memory. I began to avoid the church, afraid to see the faces of those who destroyed it by feigning holiness. Elizabeth, in turn, became nearly invisible to the world. Her clothes became baggy, her gaze distant, her smile faded. When someone asked how we were, she would say, "At peace," but her peace sounded empty. Our days became a ritual of survival. We drank coffee in silence, prayed mechanically before meals, and every word uttered felt like an attempt to remind ourselves that we were still alive. I wanted to scream, to confront the leaders, to tell the world what they had done. But fear was a thick, cold chain that bound me to my chair. There were nights when I got up to pray, alone, asking forgiveness for everything, even for what I hadn't done. I asked forgiveness for my cowardice, for my distorted faith, for having believed in men more than in God. And deep down I knew the forgiveness I sought wasn't God's, it was hers. The house grew increasingly silent. The sound of hymns, family prayers, laughter, all had disappeared. In their place was a constant echo, as if the spirit itself had departed. Faith, which once promised comfort, had become a broken mirror reflecting only guilt. And it was in that mirror that I saw my own face and realized the truth that hurt most. I was sick too. Not in the same way as her, but with a different kind of sickness, the sickness of silence. That silence that slowly kills, that steals courage, that turns love into remorse. I loved Elizabeth, but fear and guilt had turned me into an invisible man. And she, who had once been a light, now lived shrouded in shadows. Our home, once a temple of faith, had become the altar where we sacrificed what was most pure, truth. Time passed like a heavy, slow-moving river, and for a long time I drifted along it, trapped between guilt and fear. Elizabeth was no longer the same woman, and I was no longer the same man. There was a weariness in both of us that no prayer seemed to heal. The walls of our home still held framed scriptures and pictures of temples, but there was no longer any faith in them, only memories. I still pretended to believe, still smiled in the church hallways, still said, "Okay, brother," when asked. But deep down I knew something had broken. Forever. The awakening began quietly. One afternoon, while searching for a verse that might comfort my wife, I came across an online forum where former members shared their stories. At first, I joined out of curiosity, perhaps even self-defense, wanting to prove to myself that they were wrong, that they were bitter apostates. But as I read, I realized something frightening. Their stories were just like ours. Women humiliated in interviews with leaders, families destroyed by guilt, people who lost. their faith on the inside while feigning servitude on the outside. One testimony struck me deeply. A woman said her husband, a respected bishop, used his authority to silence and manipulate. Another man said he lost his wife to depression after years of religious pressure. I read in silence, my heart racing. It was like looking into a dirty mirror. The more I saw, the more I recognized myself. I discovered that my wife wasn't the only one carrying wounds of faith. That phrase stuck in my head. For years, I thought our suffering was an individual punishment, something we had to bear alone. Now I realized it was part of something larger, a pattern of pain, of abuse disguised as devotion. It wasn't the enemy trying to destroy the church. It was the church itself destroying its most faithful children. I began to doubt everything. The leaders, the promises, even the miracles that had once filled me with hope. I remember a meeting where one of the 70 spoke about unconditional obedience. As he spoke, I looked up at the pulpit and saw Elizabeth's face in my mind, the face of the woman who had obeyed until she fell ill. It was at that moment that a simple question pierced my soul like a blade. Does God really want this of us? I returned home a different person. I picked up the Book of Mormon and began reading it without the filter of doctrine, as if for the first time. And there, between the pages, I realized something I had never noticed before. It wasn't God who was asking for women's silence nor blind obedience. It was men who had put themselves in his place. That understanding wounded me and freed me at the same time. It was like waking from a dream and discovering that the world wasn't what I'd been told, but that I could still breathe. In the days that followed, I began searching for answers outside the temple. I read books on spirituality, religious trauma, faith, and manipulation. I listened to testimonies from ex-Mormons, from former missionaries, from people who, like me, had believed with all their hearts and left with it shattered. There was something comforting in hearing their voices, not because they offered solutions, but because they showed me I wasn't alone. The first step of awakening is always the most painful, because it requires admitting that we have been deceived, and perhaps worse, that we participated in the deception. I had preached, taught, and defended that institution, sincerely believing I was doing good. Now, all I saw was the suffering our words and practices left in their wake. If the church is true, I thought, why so afraid of the truth? One Sunday, I decided not to go to church. Elizabeth hadn't attended for months, but I still maintained the habit out of inertia. I woke up early, put on my white shirt and tie, but stopped in front of the mirror and felt a lump in my throat. It was like putting on a uniform from an army I no longer represented. I took off my tie, sat on the bed, and cried for the first time in a long time. I cried for her, for myself, for all those who believed. A few days later, I received a visit from a brother from the ward. He came out of Christian concern. He asked why we hadn't shown up, and before I could answer, he said in that soft, menacing tone I knew well, "Don't stray from the flock, brother. The adversary is cunning." I listened in silence, but something inside me snapped definitively. I no longer felt fear, I felt revulsion. It was the same speech they had used against Elizabeth, now directed at me. From that day on, I began to withdraw completely. I stopped taking calls. I stopped responding to messages from the presidency. I began walking alone around the outskirts of the city, gazing at the mountains and trying to remember what it was like to believe without being hurt. I discovered a strange peace, not the peace promised from pulpits, but the one that comes when you stop lying to yourself. The hardest part was accepting that my awakening meant losing the world I knew. My friends, my fellow believers, even some family members began to avoid me. They said I was being influenced by spirits of rebellion. But I knew the truth. It wasn't rebellion, it was conscience. And conscience is what institutions fear most. Elizabeth watched it all in silence. One day, she said to me, "You're becoming the man I knew again, the one who loved God, not the church." That sentence made me cry. She too was slowly beginning to heal, rebuilding her faith far from the temple walls. She began to paint, to read, to sing again, not hymns, but simple, vibrant songs. It was as if, after years of darkness, Light was finally beginning to shine through the cracks. The awakening came not as a revolt, but as a revelation. I understood that true faith doesn't demand blind obedience, but discernment. That God is never offended by those who ask questions. And that love, true spiritual love, doesn't demand sacrifice, it demands freedom. Today, when I look back, I see that it all began when the pain became unbearable. It was the pain that woke me, and it was the truth that sustained me when the ground disappeared. I discovered that my wife was not the only one carrying wounds of faith, and that our suffering, though devastating, became something sacred, the beginning of freedom. Because there is something stronger than fear, awakening. And once consciousness awakens, no temple, prophet, or doctrine can put it back to sleep. First time we attended an alumni gathering was on a Saturday morning. I was nervous, hesitant, still gripped by the fear of being recognized by someone from the church. Elizabeth was also trembling, holding my hand as if we were crossing an invisible boundary between what we had been and what we were becoming. The place was simple, a modest house surrounded by trees, with chairs arranged in a circle. When we entered, we were greeted with sincere hugs, without judgment, without disapproving looks. For the first time in many years, I felt we were in a place where we could breathe. Each person there carried a story and all, in some way, resembled ours. There was a woman who had been the wife of a stake president and lost everything when she began to question the methods of spiritual discipline. A young missionary who left the field because he couldn't bear the burden of imposed guilt. An older man, a former bishop, who tearfully confessed, "I spent 20 years telling others what to do, and I never knew how to love." His words echoed within me like a collective confession. Elizabeth listened silently, her eyes brimming with tears. When it was her turn to speak, she took a deep breath and said with a trembling voice, "I thought God had abandoned me. But now I realize he was just waiting for me here, outside the walls they built in his name." It was one of those moments when time seemed to stand still. No one said anything, just tears and a deep sense of recognition. There, in that circle, I realized that the shared pain was no longer a burden, but a bond. I realized that when pain is shared, it loses its power to destroy us. This phrase became almost a mantra between us. Each encounter was a kind of healing. The wounds that once shamed us began to transform into scars of survival. We discovered that speaking out was an act of faith, that telling the truth was more sacred than any confession before a leader. Over time, we created a small support group, a silent network of former members who gathered to talk, read, laugh, and sometimes cry together. There was no hierarchy, no titles, no rules, only empathy. It was strange and liberating. I realized that the less there was talk of authority, the more present God seemed to be. There was something pure in seeing faith reborn, without structure, without fear, without demands. One night, during one of these meetings, one of the men said, "The church taught us to serve, but it never taught us to be served. Now it's our turn to care for one another." These words touched me deeply. I, who had always considered myself strong, realized how much I needed the strength of others to rise again. And it was in this sharing of fragility that I found the true power of faith. Elizabeth began to blossom again. She began to paint, write, and smile again. Sometimes she read passages from her old journals, transforming her suffering into poetry. "Perhaps God never wanted temples of stone," she once said, "but broken hearts where he could enter." I looked at her and understood. The woman I loved was returning, but in a new form, freer, more whole. We also began helping others who were going through the same process. We received messages from people afraid of leaving, of being rejected by their families, of losing everything. I responded calmly, "You won't lose everything. You will lose what imprisons you and gain what restores your soul." Little by little, we built a community of faith outside of religion, where love was the only commandment. I remember one special night when we held an outdoor vigil. Candles were scattered across the ground, and each person lit one in memory of something they had lost: innocence, trust, peace. Elizabeth lit hers and said, "I light this for all the women who were taught to be silent." I lit mine and whispered, "And for all the men who were too slow to see." The light wind snuffed out one flame and rekindled another, as if to say that light may flicker, but it never disappears. Over time, I realized that true faith isn't born of obedience, but of empathy. That God never required us to bow our heads, He always wanted us to open our eyes. In groups, in conversations, in silent sharing, I understood what spirituality is, being alongside others with an open heart. One of the most memorable encounters was with an elderly woman named Mary Ann. She had been a teacher at the church for 40 years and said she left when she saw her granddaughter being humiliated by a leader for wearing a skirt that was too short. Tearing. She said, "I thought leaving would be the end of my faith, but it was the beginning." When she finished speaking, everyone gave her a standing ovation. It was at that moment that I understood faith doesn't die when we leave the institution. It is reborn when we stop being afraid. From then on, every meeting was a celebration of freedom. There were no more mandatory confessions, no fears of punishment, no rehearsed prayers. There was laughter, hugs, and above all, hope. I looked at those people and thought, here's the church Christ dreamed of. No walls, no power, no silence, just souls healing one another. Elizabeth and I began sharing our story publicly, not out of revenge, but out of love. We wanted others to know that there is life after fear. We recorded testimonies, wrote articles, and gave interviews. Each word was a stone lifted from our hearts, a step toward peace. Today, when I look back, I see that pain brought us together, but it was love that kept us standing. The voices that once trembled with fear now speak with courage. And I understand with a serene soul that the true temple of God is built with shared truths and hearts that have chosen the light. Because when voices unite, not even the deepest silence can erase the truth. And it was this unity that gave us back what religion tried to take from us: faith in ourselves and the God who lives within each of us. Today, looking back, I realize that this story isn't just mine. It belongs to everyone who once believed that to obey was to love, that to remain silent was to be faithful, that to endure pain in the name of faith was proof of devotion. I thought so too. I too knelt in temples believing that Elizabeth's suffering was a holy sacrifice, a cross we should bear in silence. But now, with a light heart and open eyes, I know I was wrong. Today I speak for my wife and for all who suffered in the name of blind faith. Faith is not a prison, and if it is, then it isn't faith, it's fear. For years I confused the two. I believed that being at peace meant not questioning. I believed that serving was obeying, even when the spirit within me screamed for justice. What I learned, the hard way, is that true faith isn't born of obedience, it's born of conscience. It takes courage to look into the darkness and acknowledge that it exists even within the places they call sacred. Elizabeth taught me this without words. It was in her silent gaze, in the strength with which she endured abandonment, that I learned what it means to truly love. She never stopped believing in God. She just stopped believing that He spoke through men who used His name to dominate. And it was in that moment, when she chose her own voice over silence, that I saw God's face reflected in her. For a long time I thought speaking out would be a betrayal. Today I understand that the true sin was silence. The silence that conceals, that protects abuse, that transforms the sacred into an instrument of power. The same silence that made my wife sick inside and so many others lose themselves trying to please leaders instead of listening to their own souls. Today I break the silence in the name of light, the light of truth, the only light capable of healing. People ask me if I still believe in God. I answer, more than ever, but not in the God of fear, punishment, or man-made rules. I believe in the God who sits beside those who mourn, who walks with the weary, who hears the cry of those silenced by religion. This God doesn't demand gilded temples or silent sacrifices. He asks only for an honest heart and the courage to use it. When I began telling our story, I thought it would simply be a vent, a personal relief. But with each person who writes to me saying, "I've been through this too," I realize our pain has a greater purpose: to awaken others who still live imprisoned by guilt and lies. There's something profoundly divine in telling the truth. The truth liberates, but first it wounds. It wounds the ego. It wounds pride. It wounds the structures that sustain deception. And it's this wound that heals. Today, I understand that there is no faith without freedom, that there is no true love where there is fear, and that the greatest act of worship anyone can offer to God is not to lie, not to them, not to themselves. Religion may try to silence the voices that expose its secrets, but the Spirit is not silent. He continues to speak through those who have had the courage to step out of the darkness. Elizabeth left feeling lighter, and I carry on, carrying not the weight of the past, but the mission to transform pain into voice. If you hear me now, know that you are not alone. Perhaps your silence also has a name, a face, a story hidden behind smiles and prayers. Perhaps you are afraid to speak, afraid of losing everything. I was too. But when the truth came out of my mouth, I realized that what I lost was only what never belonged to me. What I gained, peace, lucidity, the reunion with God, no one can take away. Speaking is an act of faith. Telling is an act of love. Because silence protects power, the truth protects the soul. And if your faith requires the silence of others to exist, maybe it's not faith, maybe it's just control. I learned this late, but I learned it. And that's why I speak. Today, I want to leave a message for all who once believed that God hid behind human hierarchies and rules. He is not there. He is within you. In your shudder when something feels wrong. In your tears when you feel injustice. In your courage when you decide to no longer remain silent. This is the true Spirit, not the one imposed upon us, but the one awakened within us. I don't know how far this story will go, but if it touches just one soul, it will have served its purpose. Because every time someone dares to tell the truth, a chain is broken, and every broken chain brings the world closer to the light. Commente. I'm awake. I want to know the truth. Leave your like if this story touched you. Subscribe for more real stories. And see the next video. Another testimony from someone who also dared to tell the truth. And remember, with all my heart, true faith is not obedience, it is conscience. For God dwells not in temples that demand silence, but in hearts that have chosen truth. And it is in this space, between pain and courage, that I have finally found peace.